Welcome to today's policy forum on the environmental impact of UN peace operations, co-hosted by the Permanent Missions of Finland, Italy, and Bangladesh. This event launches IPI's latest report, Greening Peacekeeping, the Environmental Impact of UN Peace Operations, by Malkit Chaussan and Dr. Lucille Martin. The report examines the evolution of the UN's focus on environmental impact, including recent efforts to strengthen the environmental policy framework, technical capacity, training, and best practices, and makes recommendations for further improvement. Over the past decade, addressing the environmental footprint of UN peace operations has become a priority for the Department of Field Support and member states. Large deployments, particularly in arid, landlocked countries, can have significant environmental impact on these countries and communities. And the UN is seeking to assist, and in the worst case, that the UN is seeking to assist, and in the worst case can pose serious environmental and public health risks to the very populations that they are deployed to assist. In response to greater awareness of the environmental consequences of UN peace operations, the UN is increasing efforts to mitigate and prevent environmental damage and potential impact on host communities and ecosystems. Addressing the environmental legacy of closing missions, as in Côte d'Ivoire, Liberia, and Haiti, has also been a matter of recent priority. The recent Department of Field Support environmental strategy focuses on issues of energy, water and wastewater, solid waste, and the wider impact of peace operations, and includes closer monitoring of environmental risk in the field and promoting a stronger regulatory framework. And we are particularly grateful to Mr. Kare, Undersecretary General for Field Support, for your participation today. Member states are also increasingly supportive of more sustainable environmental management in peace operations. Resolutions and official reports, including by the Security Council, the Special Committee on Peacekeeping Operations, and the Fifth Committee, now reference the importance of addressing environmental issues. This growing attention is also demonstrated in the recently established Group of Friends Leading on Environmental Management in the Field, co-chaired by Bangladesh and Italy, which was created to advocate for further implementation of the DFS environmental strategy. To discuss these issues, let me first welcome Ambassador Kai Sauer, Permanent Representative of Finland to the United Nations, and Ambassador Sebastiano Cardi, Permanent Representative of Italy to the UN, to make opening remarks. Ambassador Sauer, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and good afternoon to everybody. It's great to see a full house again at IPI, and congratulations for raising this very important topic to which we feel very attached to. Of course, we are also very happy to see this excellent policy paper on environmental impact of the peacekeeping operations. Congratulations for this product. The paper offers many valuable recommendations to guide our future work towards greening the blue helmets. Finland welcomes the emphasis the UN and DFS in particular is putting on the environmental questions, and we seem to have taken an important step in recognizing the challenges which we face in peacekeeping operations, peace operations, and for example, waste management, recycling, energy production, water, sanitation, and other fields. And as mentioned in the introduction, the troop contributing countries have an important responsibility in promoting environmentally sustainable solutions. Finland is very happy that Italy and Bangladesh took the initiative to create the group of friends on the environmental peacekeeping. And we, of course, joined the group with great energy and expectations. Then a couple of points which are concretely connected to peacekeeping and environmental questions. I would like to stress the importance of environmentally conscious culture. I mean, you start by training, and attitudes and mindsets. They do matter in this regard, as also recognized in the IPI's report. Training of peacekeepers is key, as each and every blue helmet has an impact on the environmental footprint of the operation. And in our experience, you start the training already as a pre-deployment training. In our case, we have a conscript system still, so all the conscripts they receive basic training, which then is extended to those and made more deeper when you go into the actual peacekeeping training. And secondly, the peacekeeping operations need to be accountable to the host countries and minimize the negative environmental footprint. And of course, we can also have a positive impact on the local communities by sharing our own attitudes and knowledge and culture on environmental sustainability and solutions. So peacekeepers in the tradition of civilian military cooperation, they can also be building up the local capacity in environmental questions. Then I would like to emphasize the role of partnerships with the private sector and academia. With the help of new technologies and innovations, more sustainable environmental solutions can be found. Our largest peacekeeping participation is UNIFIL in southern Lebanon, where we have supported projects related to environment. Also with the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, in areas such as water management and renewable energy. And we continue also to build up our own roadmap, and it's a multi-stakeholder initiative, which actually we launched from New York, but it's taking place in the capital. It's bringing together the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the private sector, and academia. So they are working together as a working group in order to create a path, a roadmap for our peacekeepers to be more environmentally sustainable. So I think I leave it at this with these couple of concrete examples. I just want to highlight our commitment, and we are also eager to learn from your report and from other delegations, participants' experiences. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And once again, I'd like to start by thanking, of course, all the panelists, Mr. Sherman, the moderator. Since, I'm nearing the end of my mandate in New York, 5 years here, that took my 5 years in the 90s, I'd like to really very much thank the IPI. We have been working with you a lot. So it's been a very important collaboration, very useful one, and you have shown that you have the ability really to position yourself as a think tank, as an organization at the edge of the research on peacekeeping, and not only on peacekeeping, on UN issues, and to share the results of a lot of people. Always packed rooms we had here, so it's always been good to be your friends and your partners in your initiatives. And I would like also to mention, of course, Undersecretary General Atul Kare, who has been a great friend, first of all, but also a visionary in a way. It's thanks to you, especially to you, I think, that Italy and Bangladesh, together with the help of Finland, which has been pioneering in a way in this field, we had this idea, following your leadership, to establish a group of friends on this important topic. So Atul, thank you, and we will continue to work with you very well, I think. So before the panel start, I think that the environmental impact of peacekeeping operation, of course, is relatively new as a topic at the UN, but it shows the multidimensional nature of peacekeeping operation that are facing a number of issues, a number of problems that we have to address possibly all together. So the more we study peacekeeping operation, peace operation, the more we understand the complexity and also the difficulty of, moving such huge amounts of troops, establishing them in a country, respecting the sovereignty of the country, but at the same time trying to achieve the mandates and the results, which are, of course, very important for international peace and security. It should therefore not come as a surprise that the interaction between peacekeeping and the environment where they are deployed has come at the center of our attention. And of course, it follows exactly the launch by Department of Field Support in 2017 of the environmental strategy for field operations. And of course, the United Nations, as we know, as we say, is a field-oriented organization. I think Atul Kare always repeat that. It is therefore important of the essence that we get it right in terms of doing no harm to the territories and the people where the organization operates. And that possibly we will leverage on the environment to be more nimble and efficient, leaving, whenever possible, a positive trace of the presence of the United Nations, not only in the environmental field, but of course in all other fields as well. The last months have witnessed an increased attention to the subject of the report before us today. On 21st December 2017, Italy was a member of the Security Council with a split mandate with the Netherlands. So we took an initiative in the Security Council in December, and we issued for the first time ever, and it was not easy, by the way, as as everything happens in the Council, a press statement. It took a few weeks to negotiate, recognizing the importance that peace operations fully integrate the environmental factors throughout their lifestyle. So in mid-February, following this initiative, together with Bangladesh, and you know that Italy and Bangladesh are among the biggest troop contributors, of course, Bangladesh in overall levels. Italy is the first Western troop contributing country. We also serve most in Lebanon, along with Finland and others in UNIFIL. So we launched this group of friends for managing the environmental impact of field operation, which now gathers almost 30 members. We hope to have more than that from all regional groups. And recently also the Santos Cruz report has pointed the connection between management of the environmental footprint and the safety and security of our peacekeepers. So finally, I should say that the reports we have received lately from the visit of the Peace Committee experts that are undergoing a visit in Africa right now. And they visited some peace operations, and things appear to be moving in the right direction in the field. Also, of course, further action is required. This is why we are here to discuss today this issue. And I'm sure that today's report and the discussion of these important panelists will represent a further positive step in the advancement of this, we think, win-win agenda. And in this connection, I would like to thank again all the panelists, the IPI, Atul Kare, especially Bangladesh, our partner of the group of friends, and Finland. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sincere thanks, Ambassador Carty, for your kind words. So in addition to Mr. Carve, let me introduce the rest of our panel, beginning with the two co-authors of today's report. First, Dr. Lucille Martin, who's a lecturer at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, and Ms. Malkid Chossan, director of the Foundation for Achieving Seamless Territory. And then Ms. Annika Wale, who's a senior analyst at the Swedish Defense Research Agency in Sweden. Each panelist will have around 8 minutes for remarks, after which we will open up the floor for questions and comments. At the end of the event, I will ask Ambassador Tariq Islam, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Bangladesh, to make some closing remarks. So with that, Mr. Kari, let me turn to you. Ambassador Cardi called you visionary, and I think the environment has been a top priority for the Department of Field Support under your leadership. So please, if you could explain why it's been so important and what you hope to achieve. Thanks.
Thank you, Director, Moderator, Mr. Sherman, Jake, Your Excellencies, my very dear colleagues, Ambassador Sebastiano Cardi and Ambassador Kai Sauer, and of course DPR of Bangladesh, Ambassador Tariq Islam, my very distinguished co-panelists. I think the significance of today's event is cannot be underplayed. It comes just 4 days before we commemorate the International Mother Earth Day on 22nd of April, as you remember. And I think it is also very great that for the first time we are discussing a report on this issue by an entity external to the United Nations, that is the IPI. And this, to my mind, bodes very well for greater interest of civil society in this particular issue and gives me hope that there is an opportunity for further enhancing the collaboration and the partnership between the United Nations, the Secretariat, the troop contributing countries, police contributing countries, the mandating countries, namely members of the Security Council, the financially contributing countries, other member states, and the civil society. Because without this partnership, nothing can be achieved, and certainly nothing can be achieved in the field of good environmental management. So I see this as a beginning of a new dawn, a new hope for better environmental management, particularly in peace operations, which means not only peacekeeping, but also special political missions where we are deployed, and also operations which are directly managed by the Department of Field Support, supporting regional organizations such as the African Union, in Somalia, the AMISOM, which is supported by the UN Support Office for Somalia, managed by the Department of Field Support. I've been very happy with your report and with the 8 recommendations which are contained in the report. So thank you very much, the authors, Dr. Mata and Ms. Soshan. I think some of those recommendations, as you would see, and I hope my co-panelists, the authors, will talk about them, but the reports on the need to increase financial and human resources dedicated to environmental strategy and planning, the implementation of a mandatory training, systemic collection of data, or advocating with member states for sustainable environmental management in peace operations are extremely critical and are directed to our partners, the member states. So they are not really directed towards the Secretariat. And this is where I think the group, which has been constituted by the permanent representatives of Bangladesh, Ambassador Masood bin Momen, and of course, Ambassador Sebastiano Cardi, will play a very useful role in taking these recommendations forward with their colleagues, the member states. I must say that I believe that both ambassadors of Italy, Bangladesh, and of course Kai have demonstrated great visionary leadership in bringing this group of 30 countries together who include financial contributors, Security Council members, troop contributing countries, but also the host countries of peace operations. And in that sense, I was particularly delighted that in the first meeting of the group of friends, which was held on 16th of February earlier this year, it was decided that all mission mandates, of course through the Security Council, should be harmonized so that they include an element of environmental management. So this is something which you were proposing in your report, but which the distinguished group of friends had also thought about and are trying to implement. They had also spoken about increasing the pre-deployment training for troops on minimizing the environmental impact, to exchange good practices with the host countries, because we also want to leave behind a positive strategy. And of course, to issue joint papers for the next meeting of the contingent-owned equipment working group, which will be held in January 2020. So we have a time period of about a year and a half, during which this group and the Secretariat will prepare these joint papers. I think I want to mention two other issues before I conclude with an attempt to answer the question which Jake had raised. And the first of them is that I think it is absolutely a requirement for those countries which have the capacity to provide assistance in good environmental management, even if they are not troop or police contributing countries, to assist those troop and police contributing countries through training or through equipment who are deployed, so that through this mechanism they contribute not only to the maintenance of international peace and security, but also that they contribute to a safer environmental management. And the second issue is that sometimes we think of solutions to environmental problems as engineering solutions. There are engineering solutions which are available, no doubt. But sometimes we need not be very high-tech. Sometimes even low-tech solutions are as good or perhaps better in dealing with environmental management than high-tech solutions. And I leave you with two examples. In Côte d'Ivoire, when we closed the mission, for obvious reasons, mission had been in existence for a long time, so we had huge amount of paper which we had to destroy. And the normal practice is to shred the paper, and after that burn the shredded paper. Now this is environmentally absolutely unconscionable, because to shred the paper you have to use a shredder, which means you have to use energy, and then you burn it, so you release carbon dioxide in the air. And we decided that instead of doing this process, we will put all the paper in recycled water, we will pulp the paper, and from that pulp paper, we will make small crates so that 12 eggs can be carried in those crates and distribute those crates free of charge to the local community. So we got our work done, we did not use energy, and also the community was very happy. So I think we need to find solutions like this. Similarly, we found that there was fuel leakage, and this happens very often, even in gas stations here. There is always fuel leakage which happens into the ground, but it becomes toxic, it destroys the ground. You can never undertake agricultural activity there. So we discovered that utilizing black soap and chicken excreta with the soil helps in actually redressing this fuel leakage which has happened. And we corrected nearly close to 10,000 tons of soil in Côte d'Ivoire, leading to a very positive thanks from the government of Côte d'Ivoire to us. Jake, I'll close there. You asked me a question, why environmental management? And I will answer it in two fashions. First, good environmental management actually contributes to peace and security. How? Because if we are using less energy, then we have to transport less fuel, and it is during the transport of fuel that our convoys get attacked. So if we have to transport less fuel, there is less convoy. If there is less convoy, then there is less chance of them getting attacked. So actually, we promote security of our people through good environmental management. Second, we prevent the recurrence of crisis in the future. Because if we do not do good environmental management, the chance of an environmentally related crisis happening in the future in a country cannot be ruled out. And finally, there's the question of reputation. I strongly believe that if we had acted far more strongly on conduct and discipline issues in early 2000, we would not be facing the type of challenge which we seem to be facing today. And if we don't deal with environmental issues today, mark my words, I will not be here, but 20 years down the line, we might be facing the same challenges on environmental issues if we do not act now. And therefore, in order to avoid our inheritors, the children of today, blaming us for not having exercised due diligence, let us do it now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Undersecretary General. Lucy, let me turn to you. I mean, your research has focused on environmental issues in peacekeeping for quite a number of years. So I'd be interested in your perspective, and particularly as one of the co-authors of the study, if you could summarize some of the key findings and recommendations that come out of the report.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to work with IPI and to present the result of this report. Sorry. So the previous intervention have shown that you have already different initiatives that have been put in place to draw attention on the environmental footprint of UN peace mission. They also mentioned a series of mechanisms intended to reduce and mitigate the mission's environmental impact. But I'd like to start my own intervention by going back to why it is so important to consider UN peace operation on environmental impact, and especially from a political science perspective. And the main reason is because it involves the UN legitimacy and credibility. The organization is expected to follow the do no harm principle. The UN is supposed to be part of the solution and not the problem, and it should take into account the environmental damage that its mission can generate. It's also under the UN umbrella that objectives and guidelines on sustainable development and climate change are adopted, and the UN has to lead by example on those issues. Yet, UN peace missions are responsible for more than half of the carbon emission of the whole UN. Mismanagement of the environmental impact of UN peace missions, as we show in the report, affects the credibility of the organization and its relationship with the local communities. This then jeopardizes the success of the whole mission. It can have disastrous consequences on the environment as well as on human health, and that's the main difference with other types of damage or violation. These environmental consequences can extend long after the mission is gone and can be irreversible. And for all these reasons, the environment should not be considered as a secondary issue, but should be taken into account from the start while designing and deploying a mission. So since the end of the 2000s, the UN Secretariat has been attempting to address these issues. In the report, we explore the different policies and guidelines that have been set up, especially since 2015, when the environment became a priority for DFS. The department launched its environment strategy at the end of 2016 and took a series of measures to implement it and to improve its oversight capacity to monitor the mission's environmental performance. The report outlines these measures and details the human resources dedicated to environmental issues at headquarters and in missions. Based on this assessment, we thus recommended to work on the implementation of this environmental strategy by allocating more financial and human resources with specific expertise on environmental management, especially in the field of waste management and engineering. And this is crucial both in mission and in headquarters, especially if we want to change the pre-deployment procedures so that a new mission will be designed from the start with environmental consideration. Because it's also a question of habits and of professional and organizational culture. And it's also a question of defining what we mean by environmental impact and what indicators should be taken into account. And as Malkiel will discuss right after, the way environmental concerns are defined could be reframed to include other dimensions, especially in regards to long-term impacts. In the same direction, we highlighted the importance of preliminary spatial and socioeconomic analysis of the local context and of systematic training for all personnel in missions. As it has been said before, if the UN wants to reduce its environmental impact, it needs to ensure that all the staff, troops, and police working under a UN flag is aware of the environmental risk of their own activities and is properly trained to address them. The report also suggested to extend the DFS partnership with UNEP to provide technical assistance along with the Global Service Center. Missions could also rely more on local expertise, especially in assessing the potential environmental and economic impacts of local sourcing. Likewise, missions should learn from each other's best practices, but as well as mistakes. In an organization where reporting is such an important task, the same environmental mistakes should not be repeated. The implementation of the environmental strategy is actually very uneven between missions. Missions do not have the same access to solutions and resources to reduce their environmental impact. Local circumstances, but as much as the mission's leadership, also affect the ecological footprint and the implementation of the environment strategy by each mission. And the headquarters still struggle to ensure oversight inside mission and to collect comprehensive and reliable data on the environmental impact of each operation. As a result, we recommended to continue reinforcing oversight by systematically collecting data on environmental management and by ensuring data ownership and accountability. Accountability is precisely the last point that I would like to make. So I started this talk by emphasizing the UN legitimacy and credibility. But the environmental impact of its mission is also an issue of accountability. And this brings to a broader issue of the uneven distribution of responsibilities within the UN peacekeeping system. We cannot understand the issue of the environmental impact of UN peace mission without considering politics of procurement and the governance structures that shape the way missions are designed, deployed, and funded. These challenges go way beyond the question of the mission environmental impact, but as we show in the report, there's benefits for more sustainable interventions, but more importantly, we warn that of the potentially disastrous effect of ignoring the significant risk of environmental mismanagement. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucille. Nakit, your work has focused on the spatial design of peacekeeping operations and their interaction with the environments in which they are deployed. Could you, as a co-author to the report also touches on a lot of your work, and you have a slide presentation, so please.
Hi. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for organizing the event, and thank you, Lucille, for collaborating on this report. And thank you for Mr. Kai Sawyer and Mr. Cardi and Mr. Kara. I took notes of from your presentation, and I appreciate, and I'm very glad to hear that in many points that you mentioned about broader impact, working in collaboration with different agencies, etc., those are the issues that we emphasized in the report. And building on the overview of Lucille of the report, I would like to use this very short amount of time to emphasize only 4 points that repeat themselves in the different elements of the report, in the report itself, in the recommendation, in the case studies. And those are, and I'm going to, just a quick disclaimer, I'm going to go through them very quickly, and they can be looked from multiple perspectives. There are other issues that needs to be taken into account, but I think those are very important issues to incorporate within the mindset and thinking of planning and designing missions. So the first topic will touch upon the spatial manifestation of peace operations. Let's see. The second will look at global logistic chains and the politics of procurement. The third point will look at the challenges and opportunities for the local community. And the fourth point is examining the value of integrated approach for legacy. The 4 topics are interlinked with one another and directly connected to the politics and the governance structure of the UN. Let's move quickly. I will start with a spatial manifestation of UN peace operation and looking at it as an architect or urban planner. Today, UN peace operations unfold at large scale in hundreds of sites. Those are cities, villages, and not so often rural areas, remote rural areas or uninhabited rural areas. So they unfolding them in large scale, and they become long-term features within these local settings. And the local environment. Military bases, camps, super camps, airfields, headquarters, and logistic hubs are planned, constructed, and deployed by the UN and its constituents as fortified islands inside and next to populated areas. For example, in 2016, UN peace operations were present in more than 170 municipalities in Africa, with a combined population of 31 million. The transition in scope and scale of missions contribute to the inflation of peace operation ecological footprint. According to data collected in 2016, field missions were responsible for more than half of the total greenhouse gas emission of the entire UN system. In the past couple of decades, the median time span of missions was 6.5 years. There is a discrepancy between the political and budgetary framework that consider peace operation as a short-term activity and the actual time of these missions, or the actual time that this mission lasts. The discrepancy leads, amongst other, to an extensive wasteful practice that has a protracted impact on the environment. The use of low, the use of low-quality modular structure that require a massive amount of energy for cooling and heating, and at the end of the mission, the structure remained dilapidated with very little value to the UN and for the local community. The second point that I would like to make has to do with the global logistic chain and procurement processes. Since the adoption of Global Field Support Strategy in 2009, UN peace operation exponentially grew. The global flow of commodities and expertise can be traced on the UN Global Marketplace, the common procurement platform for the UN. Although the delegation of services to global logistic chain resolved financial and operational stresses for DPKO, it added a new neoliberal financial agenda to the deployment of peace operation. I hope I follow the slides well. UN missions primarily rely on international suppliers and external logistics firms that not only inflate their environmental footprint, but also extensively shape and scale up the physical manifestation of missions. For instance, the Dubai-based company Ecolog has become a leading provider of catering, supply, construction, technology, facility management, and environmental services for MINUSMA. For each super camp in Mali, there is an area designated as a small base within the base for Ecolog. Inside the hub, there are workers and containers filled with supply. These aerial images depict the scale and new bases in MINUSMA and MINUSCA. The capacities and resources to maintain and support UN peace operations are imported into mission area from around the world, and I think that you touched upon this in your different presentations. And it's also result in an excessive wasteful practice that increase and solidify the inequality between the local situation and the global presence. The third issue that I would like to briefly touch upon is the challenges and opportunities for the local community. UN peace operations are often deployed in complex, fragile environment, complex ecosystems, where resources are often scarce and the governance systems are too weak to be responsive to local needs. And the scarcity often and vulnerability often lies within the center, the very center of the conflicts the UN is there to resolve. Many of these rural and urban areas where missions are taking place in are often poorly planned and built in zones exposed to natural hazards, making them vulnerable to drought and floods. Such pressures intensify with the effects of climate change and rapid population growth. At the same time, the deployment and presence of UN peace operations in these areas can add stress and obstruct local ecosystems, leaving the surrounding communities to feel the burden of sharing their limited resources with the peacekeepers. Yet, these challenges, these challenges are also addressed in other, let's say, platform that and the agendas of the UN, like the SDGs, that I rather not enter too much about it, but I think it should be considered, and some elements from the SDGs should be taken into account in the environmental strategy. And back to the local environment. So peace operations have paid few regards for the local context, and peacekeepers are poorly trained in environmental and urban management. Although there are few programs embedded in peace operations mandate, such as the Quick Impact Project or the environmental good practice actions, often these are small scale and ad hoc initiatives without a systematic thinking behind them. Taking into account the socioeconomic situation and identifying challenges and opportunities for building capacities and empowerment can help improving access to clean water, food, and healthcare as well. But it can also help significantly reduce footprint, for instance, by gradually and carefully moving from global to local sourcing, perhaps from high-tech to low-tech technologies. The last point that I want to make has to do with the integrated approach for legacy. Urban environments are complex adaptive systems. A global and large-scale intervention in such environments necessitate an integrated and multidisciplinary know-how. The report mentions a case study that we developed for several years in collaboration with military engineers, anthropologists, economists, social scientists, local stakeholders, policymakers, and urban planners, and even experts in urban farming. The cross-disciplinary conversation led to the emergence of all sorts of alternative models and opportunities for legacy to build local capacity and empower the local population. In the recommendation, we emphasize the need to take into account the local situation from the beginning to the end of the mission, to develop preliminary spatial and socioeconomic analysis and develop comprehensive indicators and integrated approach to environmental concerns, not only by engaging diverse disciplines and know-how, but also by forming a stronger collaboration between the different UN actors. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Malkit. Annika, in your work for the Swedish Defense Research Agency, you've also looked at environmental issues, not just as they relate to peace operations, but the response to complex crises more broadly, including humanitarian response. So please, you have the floor.
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank EPI for inviting me, and obviously being at the end, all the other participants and presenters for excellent thoughts and perspectives. Kind of want me to throw my notes in the recycling bin because so much good things I plan to say has been said already. But I will provide some perspective from other organizations that I've been working with on environmental issues in operations, with the caveat that the views that I express are my own and not representative of any of the organizations as such. I read the report, obviously. I think it's very timely, relevant, and important. It adds value to the ongoing work with environmental considerations. And I think that it also can serve as a learning experience for other organizations and nations, EU, NATO, member states, because in fact there has been at the sort of the grassroots analyst, military engineer level, quite a lot of exchange of information throughout the year between these organizations. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, because even if the UN is by far the biggest, with 193, I think, member states, EU has 28, NATO 29, and with partners, I mean, some nations are actually part of all these organizations, and for interoperability purposes, it's really good if member states could be better at speaking with one voice, regardless of which organization they act within. Yeah, and one thing I think why that is important is that one major gap, if you look more multi-organizational wise, is that even if every organization looks into its own environmental management and environmental footprint, the sort of the aggregated footprint of all these organizations that may work side by side in resource scarce areas such as Darfur will have a much larger and maybe irreversible impact on the natural environment. Darfur was mentioned in the report, and it's not just the peacekeeper who has over-extracted waters, it's also actually humanitarian organizations there. So the total footprint is actually much bigger, and this is a much larger problem to solve than we are talking about here today. But I think for the future, I mean, management, environmental management, it's all about striving for constant improvement. And that is something for the future, I think, when we solve all the other issues that we can engineer away, that is sort of, it has to be a constant motion. Not surprisingly, the report acknowledges the time constraint. Working environmental issues in operational conditions, in my experience and opinion, is you have to be really patient and persistent. Which is not, it's a true virtue, and I'm surprised I still work with these things after 15 years, because it can be so frustrating. I see Sophie in the audience, kind of, I think she might agree with me. It took almost 10 years for the environmental policy for the UN to be in effect, but actually EU, with its 28 member states, it took 7 years from the first idea to an environmental concept to its finalized report. So I mean, it takes time, and I think the report, I commend it for not shying away to acknowledging the fact that if you have an organization with a lot of member states, there's a lot of different perspectives and interests, and it's sometimes very hard to reach consensus. So naturally, it takes time. You have to be very, very persistent. What else? Yeah, I think one thing that is also uniquely challenging for the UN is when it comes to accountability and responsibility, because EU and NATO, they acknowledge that there is a collective responsibility for environmental management, but at the end of the day, if a single member state sort of causes an oil spill, it's a national responsibility to pay for that and remediate that. So that may be an incentive to be a little bit sharper if you end up being actually accountable to your own commander or to your own chain of command. Some other advantages that organizations such as NATO has is that they exercise regularly. So then you can sort of squeeze in environmental considerations when you are exercising during peacetime conditions, which makes it a little bit easier maybe to operate the same way. You train as you fight and fight as you train, even when it's more well, even if you are deployed in an actual operation. NATO also have a school in Oberammergau that regularly has environmental courses. So it's sort of a more systematic way, but then again, they have been doing these things for a little bit longer. So I think my point is, I suppose, is that even if it takes time, it is possible. It's not unsurmountable to get acceptable results always, also in environmental management. Because we have the perception problem about what the environment really is and if it's something that can be saved for later, and not as Ambassador Curry said about connecting it to security rather than the bugs and the bunnies. So in my experience, if you leverage environmental management on other topics such as security, forest health protection, financial incentives, it might be easier to get the low-hanging fruits. I think my 8 minutes soon are up. Well, I like to end with, I mean, we heard and we know that environmental issues comes in many shapes and forms. Some can be engineered away, and it's a good thing to start with those things that you can get fairly quick results and show proof of concept. But the more strategic thing that ties into the wider issues and the more softer, more abstract things, I think that is something that we really need to also address sooner than later. And as NATO acknowledges in its strategic concept, climate change, natural resources, degradation and depletion will probably drive future conflicts, which the alliance and other organizations will have to respond to. So if we would manage to be a little bit more proactive, maybe we don't have to end up being reactive and pay a higher price later. And I would like to end with a quote that was on a movie I saw on the long trip over here from Sweden by Winston Churchill, Sir Winston Churchill. Success is not final, failure is not fatal, it's the courage to continue that counts. And I think all the dedicated professionals and experts and practitioners, I think there's a motion going on, and I think, yeah, it's very positive. I think it's happening now, I hope. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrea. All right, so I think we'll open up the floor for questions and comments. If you could please identify yourself and keep your remarks concise. We'll take a group of questions together and then revert to the panel. All right, seeing, please.
Hi, my name is Mac, and I'm with the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. And thank you so much to the panel members. My question is to the panel about, I'm curious as to your thoughts about the efficacy of any UN regime for environmental management that doesn't provide for redress for victims of mismanagement once it happens. And I'm asking this in the context of cholera being introduced in Haiti by UN peacekeepers, and just how long it took to sort of draw an apology from the UN first, but also the fact that to date there's been very little done and victims have not received redress. So I'm just curious about what your thoughts are and what you think might be the regime best suited to address the needs of victims after the fact.
Thank you. All right, seeing no questions, why don't we come back to the panel? Mr. Kara, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, why not? I think, not everything can be seen from a purely legalistic viewpoint of civil law or common law, or particularly law as practiced in this particular country, which is quite legalistic in nature. I think what we need to do is to look at the redress for any issue, and I would refrain from talking about or trying to separate people between victims. Who are victims? Everybody is a victim. Even the people who were not directly affected by a particular issue are indirectly affected by an issue in some manner or another. And there we need to look at three things. One, what steps have been taken to ensure that such events do not happen in the future? Second, was an event a premeditated event with a motive, or was it an event which was simply an event which had catastrophic consequences but could not have been avoided? We all know illnesses which were not common in the, let's say, in the 19th century, today take on a spread which is very different. I mean, do we really believe that Zika virus would have affected pregnant women in the United States, say 200 years ago? Probably not, because we were not traveling that much. Now you are traveling. You are dealing with a very different type of an issue. Third, I think it is a bit unfair to say that just because individual payments have not been made, therefore nothing has been done. I disagree with that concept. In fact, the Secretary General himself has appointed a special envoy who knows more about this topic than I do. And we have a plan which we have put forward to the member states for what I would call community-based mechanisms. And ultimately, we also need to remember that epidemics spread because of absence of proper sewage systems or water systems which are on the ground. I mean, after all, today in Bamako, which is the capital of Mali, there is no sewage system. Do you believe that it is the responsibility of the peacekeeping operation which is deployed in Kidal to create a sewage system for the city of Bamako? No, we can't. Creating a sewage system for the city of Bamako will require an investment which is far greater than the amount which you spent on the mission in Mali as a whole. So I think we need to keep all these points into mind, and with that, look at this issue. But yes, I do agree that one of the first things which should be done, and there I think you have a point, that a genuine expression of regret by the United Nations should have happened much before than it actually happened in the case of Haiti. I think I'll stop here on this question. But since there were no other questions, I just wanted to take 1 minute of your time to mention that even when we look at deployment of peacekeeping operations, we look at deployment of special political missions or humanitarian organizations, as Ms. Anika just mentioned now, we are in a constrained environment. We have to deploy where people are. We cannot deploy that this is the best place to deploy from an environmental viewpoint, so we will deploy here. No. If there are no people there, even though there may be enough water, we have to deploy where the displaced people are, where there may be less water, and you may be competing with the resources. So what should be done? One, the recharge rate of resource, any resource, be it water, be it food, the recharge rate of any resource should be taken into account so that it is not that you completely, let's say, dry out a water table by your utilization. Second, use as much recycled water as you can. This we have started only about 2 years ago. But for example, in Darfur, now our peacekeeping mission is utilizing roughly about 40% of its water needs, as in whole of Darfur, are being met through recycled water. Third, use mechanisms to increase the water table. How? Plant more trees, plant trees which are drought resistant. For example, our mission, in its free time, there is a fellow whom I remember very well, my colleague, Mr. Baji. His name is Landing Baji. He himself, in his free time, planted 12,000 cashew nut trees. Now, somebody can ask, why cashew nut? Because cashew nut requires very little water during the first 3 years. And after 3 years, when the tree is grown, its leaves actually absorb the water which is contained in the air. So it does not require any watering at all. It's a very drought-resistant tree. Or neem, it's a very drought-resistant tree. We are planting that. So I think these are type of mitigating measures which have to be put in place. Currently, they are, as I gave you the example, they are anecdotal. I can give you one example from Cote d'Ivoire, one example from Liberia, one example from Darfur. But what we need to do together is to bring all these anecdotal examples into a real policy framework so that they can be applied wherever such a need arises. And this is where I think the challenge lies for all of us, for the Secretariat, for the member states, for you, the civil society. And I think your initiative today to bring us all together is, as I said earlier, a sense of great hope to me.
Thanks, Mr. Corey. Anyone else on the panel want to speak to that question? Okay.
Perhaps not. Well, I'm an outsider to the UN, but I do think that lessons needs to be learned from what have happened in Haiti. And one of the issues that we try to bring forward in this report is to recommend the production of preliminary research of the local situation. Make sure that if there are water bodies that are connected to sewage system, these are something that you need to be aware of. So being able to understand how the ecosystem of the local environment is working, it needs to be done preliminary before the deployment. And in order to make sure that situation as such not occur. And I would also maybe like to link to the point that Mr. Kare just mentions of no one expect the peacekeepers to start reconstructing civil infrastructure in capital cities, but I think as well that it's important to be able to identify resources and to identify potentials that exist within the existing structures. For instance, if there is a water pool somewhere in Gao for treated water collected in by the peacekeepers in, for instance, in Camp Castor, this water can be streamed to local farmers and help stimulating the growth of agriculture fields in arid environment, especially when there is drought, instead of letting it evaporate and eventually be refill the ecosystem. So I think if you study the different potentials, you can become much more effective in your actions on the ground in missions.
Thanks. Ket Lego, and then here and here.
Thank you. Firstly, let me just start by thanking you for organizing this event. And this question actually will be posed to the Undersecretary General. As a Faith Committee member, we've served together and we've went for field trips together. And firstly, I would like to just applaud, some of the implementation actually being done across the board. I've seen the works of the UN in Lebanon personally. I mean, we were both there together, Jake, and I can see efforts were actually made there. But my actual question is, with the recommendations that have been made across the board, what is your current level or rate of implementation? I know some works have been done in certain missions, and over time, we'll actually get there. But in terms of the rate of implementation, amongst those, which is very crucial, are points of awareness, of training, both staff, UN staff, and troop. What has been your assessment of this particular element? Now, this is not only the job I know of the UN, but as you've rightly said, there are those who the UN is in partnership with. For example, troop contributing countries. Have you been able to also implement or get across, the partnership to enable those that actually do the training to ensure that environmental or greening of peacekeeping is also part of the, the training that's actually being done? Thank you.
Who are you?
Oh, my apologies. Katlego Malani. I'm with the Botswana mission, and I serve in the Faith Committee. I used to work with Jake there. Thank you.
Do you want to answer that question first?
No, let's take a group, please.
Eva Lasky from the United Nations. I know there's been a lot of work being done in the DPKO DFS space, but just sort of tacking on from what I guess Ms. Swale, sorry if I mispronounced your name, is talking about in terms of cooperation with other actors in that space, like the humanitarian space. What is the UN currently doing in terms of collaborating with OCHA, and what opportunities, I guess, do other panel members see for interacting with OCHA in this space with a view to, working within the same sort of mandate?
And then there was one in the middle.
Hi, thank you all for your remarks. My question was on the procurement matter that you touched on. I think you spoke about the environmental impact of dealing with companies based overseas, but I was wondering, in addition to that, what mechanisms exist for seeing that these contractors uphold certain environmental standards? What accountability mechanisms are there? If you could touch on that. Shamina de Gonzaga, World Council of Peoples for the UN.
And then finally, Alexei, why don't we take your question, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Thank you very much. Alexis Berthier from the French mission to the UN. Thank you very much to all the panelists for all the information that you provided. Thank you to IPI, the Mission of Finland, Italy, and Bangladesh for organizing. We are a member of the group of friends that Bangladesh and Italy organized, and we're very happy to do so. We see all this work being done also as contributing to the more global efforts against climate change and for environmental responsibility across the globe. So it's something that is really useful. We're absolutely grateful for the report. And one of the things that here in the UN counts is also to gather the support of member states. And as the colleague who is in the fifth committee mentioned, that's something also that can be done through that body. One of the elements for this is the cost. And I think, as a couple of the panelists mentioned, it's an investment to do all this work, but also it has long-term savings. So I wanted to know whether any of you have been able to do case studies or general assessment of, well, how much it costs maybe to start the policy or to start at a specific place, but then how much it saves in the long term for the UN and for member states, because I think that's an element that, if brought to the attention of member states, can help make them aware of the value of this policy. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Why don't we come back to the panel? We could go in reverse order. Malkit, do you want to respond to any of the questions?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question about OCHA. And I think there is so much knowledge accumulated within different UN agencies. It's not just OCHA, but UNDP and other organizations that are operated in contexts where missions are taking place. And it's extremely important to be able to make sure and create framework through which knowledge is streamed and shared and information is shared. And if there are resources that can be shared, they are shared as well. Just a quick example of something that might be relevant to demonstrate how important sharing information is. Just this photograph here is a photograph that I took in the super camp in Gao in Mali, where the head of the environmental department of the base explained a military engineer from Camp Castor that it's adjacent to the super camp. So it's two camps, only one fence split between them, split them apart. The Dutch managed to develop a drain system, low-tech draining system, just a type of dig that allow draining all the flood water, but the UN Cup was flooded. So he showed him this image, how to deal with flood. So for me, like just witnessing this situation showed me how necessary it is to exchange information and be able to share information with different actors. And I'm sure that with OCHA on humanitarian level, you can also get a better understanding of the scarcities and the vulnerability that exist in the local situation, try to find bridges with what is going on and the availability of resources in the peacekeeping. And maybe one quick remark to what you've asked about budget. I think there is a need to invest more. I'm not an economist, so I won't enter to all the details, but we did work at some of the case studies that we developed with economists from Peace and Security, and they developed some alternative models to rethink about how budget is divided and how procurement is done and how fees are scrutinized such that there is that UN missions don't create a parallel reality when they arrive to a third world countries with salaries of $200 a month per person, and then start having an influx of and overpaying services to local companies. And so I think like rethinking the procurement system, rethinking the financial models that are in place are important, and not only in investing in the environment, but also finding ways to improve in overall the impact of peace operations in the context that they are operating.
Thanks. Annika.
I would like to address the question. First, the one of OCHA and other UN organizations. There is a joint UNEP-OCHA unit in Geneva. I used to work there for a while. And they are participating together with the DFS environmental, the REACT project and so on. And there's also an environment in humanitarian action working group. There is sort of a loose network of various kind of organizations, and everyone who would like to be involved in that is welcome to do that for information exchange purposes. That's a short answer to that. And also when it comes to proof of concept of what savings you can do and so on. I mean, in the 2012 policy report that DFS and UNEP did, we did some consulting work and did some return of investment calculation for energy efficient camps. And depending on how far from a port you are and so on, if it's landlocked or not, I mean, sometimes it can be up to 3 or 4 years to have fully gotten return on your investment. It can be also as little as 2 years. And given that we know what the average length of a UN mission is, regardless of the 1-year mandate, it is worth the money to invest a little bit now to get back much more later. And if you also connect to the security situation in Afghanistan, they have seen the dire consequences of actually measuring fuel consumption in human lives and blood, a casualty factor for resupply for both water and energy. And the expeditionary way of handling and storing fuel in fuel bladders. There was a mortar attack in December in Gaia. 72,000 gallons of jet fuel was exploded and leaked out and were close to where people are living. So money is one thing, but I think also the acceptance from nations that their soldiers doesn't come home alive is also a really good incentive if you can have hard facts on that, and there is such facts. Thank you.
Thank you for these questions. I'm going to also tackle 2 of them. The first one on the assessment of the implementation of the policy, which was something that we tackled in the report, and you mentioned specifically training and pre-deployment training. So what we can say now is that in the current training material for pre-deployment, you have a module on the environment and natural resources. But from that, what we need to decide is do we know if member states going to apply it or not? And that's the most difficult point is, and that's why this was one part of the recommendation. And it was also mentioned in the presidential statement from the Security Council that was mentioned, that was released in December, that member states are responsible for training their own troops and police. And so even if now the UN is providing all the materials and they are not the one being able to do that, but that's why also in the recommendation we suggested to have with more human resources in mission training, so that even if the troops will not be trained before deployment, then in the mission they could be trained, and also with more like specific training regarding to the local context. And this can bring to also the question of the procurement and environmental standards in the procurement. So there was this question of is there like already environmental standards? This is also really tricky because of member states. This is member states' decision if they want or not to include environmental standards. Now you have a bit of incentive, like a 5% incentive to have like more ecological material, but for the moment there is still individual member states with their own interests, and it's difficult to reach an agreement to have better environmental standards. Thanks.
Mr. Corey.
Very good. Thank you for all the questions. I would just try to bring all 4 a bit together, because my colleagues have already answered them much better than I would. On rate of implementation, I think the implementation is patchy, and it will remain patchy for some time to come. A very distinguished member of the Advisory Committee on Administrative and Budgetary Questions asked me, Mr. USG, you announced your strategy in November 2016. Today, it is March 2018, more than 1 year. Why has it not been achieved? I didn't know how to answer that question. I mean, maybe I think if this distinguished member had asked the same question, why we have not been able to keep together as a world the global climate warming at below 1.5 degrees centigrade, I think perhaps I could have understood. Environmental strategy is not achieved in a period of months, and certainly not in a period of weeks. It is something which will require, as Anika mentioned, persistence and perseverance, patience, over a long period of time. There is inertial momentum, and we have to factor that into account. On humanitarian space, again, Anika answered that question, but I think currently there is one slight challenge. DFS is very closely associated with DPKO. And this brings a problem with humanitarians, because humanitarians don't want to be that closely integrated or associated with military. For obvious reasons, for their guiding principles on humanitarian assistance and so on. And this is one of the things which we will correct through management reform. You know, the Secretary General has proposed that we should have a Department of Operational Support instead of having a Department of Field Support, which will then support everybody. I mean, be it peacekeeping, be it OCHA, be it officers away from headquarters. So I think we'll be able to move away from that and thereby expand the environmental cross-fertilization. On procurement, again, I think Martin's answered it, that it is up to the member states to decide what standards to put into procurement. There are some contracts which have environmental standards. For example, food contracts. You know, we are not going to accept a food which has any danger of botulism or which has any danger of being infected by listeriosis or some other illness. You know, so but I would caution against one element, which is local procurement. Local procurement is a preferred modality provided two elements are met. One, that the market in which we are procuring should be elastic. That means as we procure in the local market, the production should grow. And therefore, the price remains stable. If the market, on the other hand, is inelastic, and we procure, then actually what we will be doing is we will be pushing those who are on the margin of food insecurity into food insecurity, because we will be procuring all the food and there will be no food left for the local people. So I think we need to be very careful when we procure in the local market to make sure that we do not destroy the market for the local people. I mean, they depend on it. I think those are the questions which I wanted to address. And I'm sure that with your own assistance, the civil society putting its ideas through its member states, and then the member states bringing those ideas into the decision-making body, the General Assembly of the United Nations, I think we have some hope of succeeding. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Corey. Let me now invite Ambassador Islam to make closing remarks, please.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I regret that my ambassador and permanent rep, Ambassador Momin, could not be present here today due to Sir last-minute change in his program. It's always intimidating for me to make the concluding remarks because in this case you have the minimal time to react. Still, I have something. It has been an extremely rich discussion centered around the DFS environmental strategy and the IPI report titled Green Peacekeeping, the environmental impact of UN peace operations. The more we hear from Under-Secretary General Atul Khare, the more we feel convinced that the work that needs to be done for sound environmental management in UN peacekeeping operations. It not only makes sense for the do no harm principle that the UN upholds, but also makes a compelling case for improving the safety and security of our peacekeepers by reducing the convoy movements. It is also encouraging that the Under-Secretary General has readily espoused the seminal recommendations made in the report by Dr. Martians and Ms. Shoshan. The USG has aptly reminded us that some of the recommendations would need to be carried forward and put into practice by member states themselves. And I am personally encouraged to hear about the low-tech and the innovative solutions that USG Kare has mentioned. And I think that holds one of the keys to development of a sustainable environment management strategy. In that context, we hope that the group of friends that Bangladesh and Italy have set up earlier this year would be able to play a catalytic role. Italy's experience in facilitating the adoption of the presidential statement in the Security Council in December last year had been a critical building block. It also proved that there were still a number of outstanding questions that needed to be addressed in order to bring all concerned stakeholders on board with the modalities for implementing the UN environmental strategy. In specific terms, the group of friends would continue to advocate for mainstreaming environmental considerations across the UN operations and perhaps eventually to other field-based operations. The group would also promote further coordination across the United Nations system, focusing on enhanced partnership with UNEP. The group remains a steadfast voice in promoting pre-deployment training for personnel on mitigating environmental footprints on UN peacekeeping missions. The question of enhancing human and financial resources for implementing the environmental strategy would perhaps pose to be the most challenging one. We hope that open and constructive dialogues such as these would help lay a solid foundation for making a difference in resource mobilization. The group of friends would look forward to undertaking specific work in this regard during the next session of the COE working group. We strongly believe that the outreach to the local community on environmental management, including for building local capacity, can be crucial for winning the hearts and minds of the people the UN peacekeepers serve. We thank the researchers for highlighting some of the useful civil-military activities conducted by our peacekeepers in MINUSMA, and also those areas where they could certainly improve their performance in the vulnerable setting they operate in. We thank Finland for facilitating this useful report. We look forward to further supporting its publication and wider dissemination. And I would just to mention a few points that has come up in the discussion. One is that has been brought up by the Finnish PR, the environmentally conscious attitude, awareness building, and having that culture ingrained within ourselves. That is, I think, very important. And also, this environmental management, it is not to be relegated. It has to get the political support that it needs. And at the same time, we appreciate the IPI's efforts in coming up with this report. This is an indication that people are taking more interest, taking this with more sincerity, and we subscribe to this eclectic approach. And local context analysis and local best practices are the other things we need to look at more seriously. As we observe 30 years of Bangladesh's contribution to UN peacekeeping, we consider focus on environmental management to be yet another right thing to do. As a country under environmental stress and climate change impacts itself, we remain committed to lead by example by also enlisting our peacekeepers in preserving and protecting the ecosystems that support their work. We look forward to your active participation in these endeavors in the days to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and let me thank all of you for joining us, and once again to extend my thanks to Bangladesh, Italy, and Finland, and to our panelists for joining us. Have a good afternoon.